Emma, welcome on to the show.
Thanks, Andy. Really good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I am so excited to have you here. You're one of my favourite people in the property industry. We know each other really, really well. You're a member of the HMO Mastermind, and you have got so much experience, a phenomenal wealth of experience. And I know we're going to have a lot of fun on today's show. And we've already been pinging some ideas back and forth, haven't we, about the stuff that we want to talk
Mm.
about. And actually, I know that we're really quite aligned on a lot of stuff as well. And equally, when you and I are both quite strong-minded, and when we've got our own way of doing something or have done it in a different way, we're also quite happy to kind of talk about that and challenge each other. So, really, really excited about today's show. Now, you're a podcast veteran, you're a HMO veteran, but uh, if there's a small chance that some of our listeners haven't yet come across you, Emma, can you just give yourself, a bit of a brief intro? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your property business and interests.
Yeah, sure. So I first got into property full time back in 2013. Prior to that, I'd been in the corporate world for 17 years, working in London and also internationally. Loved my job, but got to the point where I think a lot of people go through this in the corporate world. I just started to get itchy feet. I was working lots of long hours and just stress was really starting to get to me. And then I had, a couple of life-changing events, and it just really made me think about my life. And I decided that I needed to get out of the corporate world. And I came across some property training, like lots of people do, but it just opened my eyes to what could be possible. So at the time, I couldn't just quit my job. I was earning a really good salary, and I needed to replace that. So I went down to 4 days a week, and I had to do HMOs basically. I had no choice because I knew that if I wanted to get out within a short time frame, I needed to maximise the cash flow. So I live in Cambridge. Didn't have the capital to start investing in Cambridge, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later. But like lots of other people, went up north and thought, can buy some decent sized properties up there. So I started in Manchester, which I knew quite well because I'd been a student there myself. And I bought my first student HMO, and that was back in 2012. And I spent 18 months just driving up and down, making lots of offers, buying really horrible houses and refurbing them, and just building HMOs basically. And I got to the point where after about 18 months, I'd got enough cash flow to replace my salary and handed in my notice. And that was really the start of my kind of property full-time career. And ever since then, I've carried on. So I've diversified quite a lot over the years. I've done lots of different developments, flats, bungalows, all kinds of different projects, lots of different HMOs as well, big, small, and in different locations. So quite diverse, but obviously today we're talking about HMOs, and HMOs actually, are still very much my passion. Having tried lots of different strategies, I still go back to the HMOs. I love the cash flow, and I love the way the whole business works. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. And I think the other thing to point about is, for me, I work really hard, but it is also about living your best life now. For me, there's no point in waiting. So for me, it's about trying to have balance. So that's having the flexibility. If I want to go off and play golf, or if I want to go on holiday, I normally, pre-COVID, spent a lot of time in Spain. So I normally spend kind of 2-3 months every summer there. And that's really important to me that I can do that now. I don't want to wait. So yeah, property, has afforded me that lifestyle, which has been great.
Well, there's no doubt you've earned your stripes, Emma, and it's great to see actually when you're out on the course and stuff like that, because I do know how hard you work, and yeah, you're very similar to me, I think, in that sense that you that's just the way you're programmed. You're a hard worker, you graft, and but you also try and take the benefits of that, enjoy the benefits of the cash flow that you've generated and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think you're a great model for a lot of people actually, to follow and try and replicate and emulate, because what you have done and achieved in the property space is amazing. And I'm really excited to talk about some of that today, and particularly this case study that you brought, that's going to be inside the roadmap, which is, I said to you before we kicked off today actually, that it looks like something from central London, like a boutique hotel, 6-star accommodation. It's absolutely amazing. So I'm really excited to talk to you about that as well today. But Emma, when did you first actually invest in HMOs? When did you buy the first one?
So the first HMO that I bought was in 2012.
Okay.
The first one I bought, actually, I didn't really buy it in the way that I was kind of taught to buy it, because I hadn't done any training at that stage. I literally, just at that point, really didn't know very much. I'd let out a buy-to-let flat that I had in London for a few years, because I worked in Australia for quite a few years. And that was really my first experience with cash flow. So I think the only thing I really knew about property was yield. And so I'd looked at, kind of compared a few yields across the country, thought, oh, Manchester looks quite good, know the area well, and knew all the student streets there. So I'd say when I bought the first one, it was really kind of, some of it was chance. It was yield based, but I bought a property that was an existing student HMO. Didn't really know anything then about refurbs and adding value. I literally put down a deposit, got a mortgage. The property was already let, had students in it, it was fully managed, and that was how I did the first one. And it was only after doing that that I suddenly thought, actually, like anything, you don't know what you don't know. And that's when I came across Rich Dad Poor Dad, like a lot of people, which kind of opened my eyes to maybe the correct way to do things. And I did some training, and after that, again, I think doing a little bit of training again, you kind of think, actually, there's so much stuff that I don't know that I really need to know if I'm going to scale this. So that was the first one. And after that, I then, like I say, got training, had various mentors, and changed the way that I approached things after that first one.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about you, Emma, is that even though you have got this experience and you've kind of seen and done and heard it all in the industry, you still always look for opportunities to learn more and get the edge. You're a member of the HMO Mastermind, and you certainly give as much to our other members and other members of the HMO community as you take. But I think it's really interesting to see somebody who's achieved what you have, but still look for areas to be better. And this project that we're going to talk about today is, I've been following your stuff for a long, long time. You've done incredible stuff, but this is absolutely phenomenal. Is that, again, the way that you're programmed, Emma, or do you have to consciously remind yourself to take advantage of learning from other people, look for methods and strategies to give you the edge in your markets? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I'll only do something if I'm going to do it properly, and I think that's just inherent. I've always been like that. But I think I've always one, I love kind of learning from other people anyway. And I just think this industry changes all of the time. If you look at HMOs now compared to even back in 2012 when I started, and you think about how much the market has moved on, how do you learn that? You learn it from other people that are doing it. And I've always been a massive advocate of learning from people that are active in the market, that are actually out there doing the strategy that you want to do. And I think very early on, like I say, in my first year in property, I had a mentor, really inspirational guy. I learned so much, and I think that's what kind of pushed me, just looking at the kind of things that he was doing at the time. And it just made me think, actually, I can do that. So, and then I think what's happened in recent times is, again, there's so much social media. And, I've obviously met all of you guys initially through social media, just looking at what you're doing. And I think there's so many opportunities to learn. But I think how the space has changed is, you need to operate like you're running a business. And I think when you work in property, it can be quite a lonely journey. Quite often we're all working in different locations. I actually don't know many other people that operate in Cambridge where I live. So for me, it's very much about networking, connecting, and just constantly adapting. You've got to stay ahead with the market. The market changes so quickly, and I think especially at the moment, we'll probably talk about it, it's quite a challenging market. If you
Yeah.
don't stay ahead, I just don't think you're going to succeed. So yeah, it's important for me to carry on learning always.
I couldn't agree more. I think, remember 10 years ago, maybe more, when I got involved, and looking back, I mean, it didn't feel easy at the time to get in. There were still hurdles to overcome. There was still a certain barrier to entry. But looking back on that now and looking at what people have to do to get in initially, or even people like us who've been doing it for years, and the hurdles we have to, get over, and the hoops we have to jump through
Yeah.
just to make deals work. The amount of friction is phenomenal, and I do think that you have to treat this like a business now. I don't think it is any longer something you can just do on the side, because I think there's too much risk,
Yeah.
and I think it's, for so many people, just too difficult unless you can actually commit, provide a certain amount of time to it, a certain amount of cash capital, and bring the knowledge and experience to make sure that you do it right. I think the industry will just kind of chew you up and spit you out if you're not approaching it like that anymore.
Yeah.
And listening to you and the way that you talk about your business and approach your business and your projects, in the last year, you've been incorporating, haven't you? Because you've got some huge tax considerations,
Yeah.
which is, I suppose, a blessing and a curse. But you're constantly trying to evolve your own business as well. So I completely agree, with that sentiment. We've really got to look at what we're doing now as a business.
Definitely.
I've got a few things that I want to kind of throw at you then, Emma. Normally, I don't like to put people on the spot, but I think we can have a good conversation about this sort of stuff, and then I want to come back and circle round to your case study. But um, let's talk about the overall strategy, and for people getting into the industry now, you've done all sorts. In fact, this case study that we're going to talk about today as well, you had a couple of different approaches that you were considering initially. How do you or how have you determined your overall strategy, Emma? And for anybody listening who's maybe at the earlier stages, maybe where you were in 2012, 13, getting in, what kind of advice would you give them at this stage to help formulate a strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think my strategy has changed over the years. And I think, when you start out, you maybe have different goals to, my goals now, for example. I think when I first started, like I say, my strategy was just very cash flow driven. It was literally, how can I replace my salary in the quickest time possible? So it was HMOs. I knew it was going to be HMOs. In terms of area at that time, again, it was just, I looked, like I say, at Manchester. Article 4 came in pretty quickly in Manchester, so I moved across to Liverpool just because they were close together. And at the time, there was a lot of great opportunities in Manchester and Liverpool. So that was probably, the strategy then. And then the strategy past that was just try and find the worst buildings possible, but in the best locations. I mean, I've always been really, really fussy on location, and that's something still that I won't compromise on. I think you can change lots of things about a building, but you can't change the location. So location is massively important. And at the time it was about, how can I add value? It was about extracting as much cash as possible from the deals that I was doing and building that cash flow. But like I say, at the time, it was also quite time consuming because Liverpool is a good 4.5 hour drive for me. So I was spending a lot of time driving up and down the country. I was staying away from home a few nights. It was very much a juggling act as well because I've got young kids. So it was okay that my husband worked in London as well, so he wasn't home very much. So it was really trying to kind of, juggle a lot of things. But I was on such a mission to do it that that was about as far as the strategy went. And the strategy at the time was, once I'd got something up and running, I would pass it over to a managing agent. They would look after it for me. And that was how it went. And I then started doing, once I'd built that cash flow, I started dabbling in other things. It was, as I say, it was quite building dependent, depending on what I could find. So if I found a block of flats, I would do that, or bungalows or whatever. And it was really only, I think, a few years later when I found a building in Cambridge where I live that it kind of opened my mind to investing in kind of, higher capital areas. For anyone that doesn't know Cambridge, Cambridge is a small city. It's about 45 minutes away from London. Everyone's probably heard of Cambridge University, but it's probably one of the most expensive places to live in the country. I was reading the other day, the average price now in the city centre is over 900,000 for a terrace, and across the whole Cambridge area it's over 500,000. So the market is pretty intense. It's not going to be everything that works, and it's very hard to find things. Even in a decent market here, it's hard to find stock. But I found a building at the time that was literally just around the corner from where I lived, city centre, and I went to view it, did the numbers on it, and I thought, actually, this could work. Like everything in Cambridge, it went to sealed bids, but I built a really good rapport with the agent. I told him about my business up north and managed to secure it. And it was really, that was my first student HMO that I did here. So again, it was a market that I didn't really know in this locality, but obviously I had the HMO experience. And I think having done that, when you start doing a refurb that's literally 5 minutes walk from your house, you kind of realise, wow, this is so much easier. So I then started actively trying to look for things here. And it is a different strategy because obviously you're paying a lot more money. It's a lot more capital intense. But at the time, I found that I was leaving cash in deals even up north. I think, those days of being able to do everything, where you get all your cash out, I think it's possible maybe in a few instances, but I think, it was becoming less and less. So I kind of thought, well, if I'm leaving cash up north, I may as well leave cash here where I've got the capital appreciation as well. And Cambridge is one of those cities where the market just goes up so quickly. Everything is massively in demand. So I decided really to shift my strategy. And ever since then, I've been actively buying here. And like I say, across the years, I've tried everything from 4 or 5 bed HMOs right through to big kind of, I've got lots of 10 beds, 15, things like that. And I think it's only through experimenting and actually running an HMO, it's very easy to write down the numbers before you buy something and think, right, okay, this is how the deal's going to stack. But when you actually run an HMO, and every building is different, I think the other thing I've learned is even if you take a building back to brick, I think in the first few years I thought, oh yeah, it'd be great, take it back to brick, do an amazing refurb, I'm never going to have any maintenance. And as we all know in HMOs, that just so isn't true. And I think there are some buildings that are more problematic than others. So I think you have to keep going back and looking at actually what is making you money. And I think that's, it's the same as any other business. And it goes back to your point about running it like a business. Certain buildings I've learned just work better than others. And I just tend to find that actually my stuff here at the moment, I manage myself. And I find that I can make a much better margin. So my buildings here are more profitable. And I can control, my kind of fill rates, my occupancy rates. Everything is just so much more controllable, I think, when it's on your doorstep.
Do you think, looking back now, would you do it differently? Or do you think that is just the natural evolution of business and perhaps you wouldn't change anything? Because it sounds like along the way you obviously recognised that there were opportunities to make perhaps even more money around the Cambridge area, but clearly the location piece was important. So would you have done it any differently now looking back, Emma? If you could reverse the clock, or if you were advising someone at, who's at that stage you were in 2012-13, would you tell them to do it differently?
I think looking back on, for me, I probably wouldn't. Because I think at the time, like I say, I didn't have the capital. I think you need to have a look at what your circumstances are. And I think at the time also there was a lot of opportunities in Liverpool. Liverpool's a big city, and some of the projects that I've done, I probably wouldn't do those kind of projects here because I just wouldn't be able to afford to buy the buildings. So I think it's given me a lot of kind of build refurbishment experience that I wouldn't have got here. I think if I was advising someone now, I think if you could start maybe within an hour of kind of being close to your home, then that's probably where I'd try and start. Just because, again, I think the market's changed. I think there's so many people trying to do it. It's so competitive. And I think if you can't jump on viewings and deals very quickly these days, you're just not going to secure them. So I think to answer your question, I wouldn't have done it any differently. I think also I met so many great people investing up north, and I learned a lot from them as well. And I think, maybe investing further from home is really hard. So you've got to set up kind of systems, processes in order to manage things like that. It's a lot harder. So maybe some of the things that I did, because I started with some of the hardest projects that I've ever done, it's probably, nothing really phases me now. So coming back to my local project where I've had loads of issues on the last one that we're going to talk about with the case study, I think, if I'd done that to start off with, I probably would have scared me to death. Whereas now, I just kind of take it all in my stride. You have to.
You definitely do. I guess when you've done it for a few years and you've got an established portfolio, I think it's easy to kind of sit on a pedestal and make certain recommendations. And often we do have to remind ourselves that when you're getting started, you've kind of just got to do what you've got to do. And very similar to you, when I first started investing, I had to invest several hundred miles away. I didn't have the capital and the equity. It came straight out of uni and had to work incredibly hard to do that, and had to have a strategy that was kind of congruent with that, as well as it was generating cash flow. And I didn't know much about what I was doing. I think if 10, 12 years ago I was the person I was now, I probably wouldn't do it because I'm more reserved now and I like to plan and think about stuff more. But I'm really grateful of that younger version of me who was a bit happy to take risks, who didn't maybe think about all of the consequences. And it's difficult to condone that, but at the same time, it's a tough industry, and sometimes you've just got to do what you've got to do. And I think what you said about trying to invest about an hour away is invaluable, because I do think that that's one of the big compromises that a lot of people make without really thinking about it too much. I think it's okay to do it, but I think, and actually I want to ask you about it, there definitely are consequences to investing further away. So let's do that. You've invested far away, you now invest very close to home. Let's talk about some of the issues that investing at distance.
I think one of the biggest things in the HMO industry at the moment, as we all know, is it's not just about the product, it's about the whole tenant experience. And I think one of the things you realise is in order to drive profit, you have got to control occupancy, time to fill rooms. You've got to control all of your costs, your maintenance, your utilities. All of those things are so important. And I think when you're reliant on managing agents, and I've had lots of different managing agents in different locations, I've just learned over the years that, even if they're doing a good job, and let's face it, they manage a lot of properties, I think, I've learned with things like occupancy, whereas my expectations are 100%. I've learned that when you're using an agent, you're probably looking at about 85, and that's pretty good, even in an amazing product. So you have to learn to, kind of give a little. And I found that, that's one of the challenges for me, is things like, I'm not there to try and sort things out. Whereas locally, again, if you're controlling your own business, you can kind of stage a room when someone moves out. Quite often agents won't do that. It's just little things. If there's an emergency, you can't get to the property quickly, The other thing that happens is, again, I know we all go in and do these massive refurbs when we buy something, but 5 years later, when the property's looking a bit tired, and you've got tenants still living in it, for professionals, for example, how do you get that property refurbed? And when you're kind of 4.5 hours away, it's quite challenging. So I think there's lots of different things that, I just find quite challenging managing them from afar.
I think there's some great piece of advice there. And actually, some of those issues can become quite significant.
Yeah.
We've had it before and worked with people where they've had a professional let, was done to a really great standard. For whatever reason, they've ended up with some empty rooms. And when they've come to refinance, they've not been able to refinance with those voids because the lender has wanted to see all the tenancy agreements and the continuous record of rental history. And at that point in time, they've struggled. They've struggled to demonstrate that. And then they've struggled to get the valuation that they needed, and actually struggled to get some of the lending from anyone that they needed. So some of these can be quite significant.
Yeah.
And in fact, just last night as well, in one of the properties in our portfolio, there's a gas leak, and that's the sort of stuff that I want to know about. Potentially really quite serious, and that at a distance becomes very difficult to manage. You can still put solutions in place to manage it, but I certainly think that it's easy to contain the risk the closer that you are to that sort of property. So I think there's some great pieces of advice that you've just shared there, Emma. I've got a question I'm dying to ask you. Now, I know where you sit in this camp, but I want to have that conversation on the podcast because I love talking about it. And I don't think people are talking about student accommodation enough. But I'm just going to hit you with it. Students or professionals?
Students, definitely. Yeah.
Students, definitely.
Definitely. Again, I think you learn through experience, don't you? I do lots of both, but I just find the student lets so much easier to run.
Yeah. What is it that you find easier, Emma?
I really like the life cycle, the fact that if you systemize the business, you're only a bit busy a couple of times a year. That original kind of viewing cycle. And then the period just before they move in. I like the fact that you've got that dedicated kind of maintenance time every year. And, I also like the fact that they're on one AST. I like the fact that they come as a group, they're friends. And I just find them generally a lot easier to kind of deal with. Much as I love my professionals, I just find that, when you've got people moving in and out at different times, there's a lot more maintenance as well. So I just find the students a lot easier to look after.
It surprises a lot of people when we say that actually the maintenance in the student HMOs is generally less than the equivalent professional HMO. And one episode at a time, Emma, I'm just converting more people into student landlords. But I think it's an amazing strategy. The one thing I will say is that it's definitely more competitive. The barrier to entry is much higher. And I think it's simply because of location. I think statistically, I think values on average are about 15% higher than equivalent properties if they're in the immediate vicinity of the university campus. And ultimately, that's probably a combination of the Article 4 direction, which is in place around most universities, and the demand for that accommodation there. And that accommodation often works for students and young professionals, and in certain areas, particularly like Cambridge, young families, young couples as well. So it is definitely a bit more challenging to enter that space. And I've got some courses on that inside the roadmap actually, but that is one thing I have seen change over the last decade. The prices in the student market have pulled away a little bit, and it's for good reason. It's because it performs so well and consistently performs so well, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think again, the student market's changed massively, hasn't it? As we know, students are very savvy these days about expectations, and they know all kinds of things that I'm sure we never knew when we were students. And I think again, this year has been a real test for kind of the student market. With COVID and so many of them kind of not being around. So I think, but I'm like you, I still believe that it will be a good market. But I think you're right, you've got to really know it well down to individual streets,
Yeah.
and know exactly what they're looking for in order to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I'm dying to talk about your case study. So, as usual, guys, Emma's case study will be available inside the HMO roadmap. Now, I've already seen it and it's incredible. The backstory, the before and after photos are amazing. And, the numbers on this project are staggering as well. So, this is a 7-figure HMO project, which is really exciting to be able to talk about. I think we've only talked about one at that sort of level on the podcast before. So, Emma, can you tell us a little bit about the background of this project and why you bought it?
Yeah, so like I say, Cambridge is a very challenging market to buy in, and there's very few things here that will actually work. So I just look for whatever opportunity, and I'm always looking for kind of things that other people aren't particularly interested in. There always has to be an angle here. You're never ever going to be able to buy below market value here. It just doesn't exist. Everything goes to sealed bids. So it's always about adding the value instead, through square footage normally, or other angles. So this property, I should point out, I only really look in central Cambridge because of the tenant groups that I'm targeting. Namely professionals or students. So most of them want to live kind of city centre, which again kind of makes it a small market to fish in. And you're normally competing with people that want to live in the properties themselves as well. So it makes it hard. Anyway, I came across this building. It's literally 2 seconds around the corner from another property that I own. And I just happened to walk past one day and noticed that there was a sale board outside. But it was also on the market with an agent that I knew really well, that I've bought through quite a few times. Excuse me. So I spoke to the agent about it. And the reason it had just come back on the market was actually it had been on the market with another agent and the previous sale had fallen through. So I thought, okay, early days, let's get a viewing, go in and have a look. And the property was a guest house. It was set up as a guest house, looked like a guest house, still got kind of guest house signage on it. So I went in to book a viewing, and as soon as I walked in, I thought, this is a great property, just in terms of the size of the rooms, and the whole scale of the property. It's in Cambridge, again, a lot of the properties that you tend to get on the market tend to be kind of quite small terraces. So you always, room sizes here, it's difficult to find decent sized rooms. So this one was completely different. The average room was probably about kind of 20, 25 square metres. So I thought this looks good. The property was in really bad condition. It had been really neglected. It had kind of quite a strange layout. If anyone kind of wants to look at the pictures I've put on the case studies, it had some quite interesting shower rooms in bedrooms that weren't proper rooms, and lots of other interesting bits. It also had quite a big garden as well, but good location. So I started talking to the agent and thought, yeah, I'm sure I can do something with this. At that point, I wasn't really sure what, because I needed to try and work out what it was. And whilst it was on the market as a guest house, it was a bit of a strange situation because the previous owner had moved back into it, and when they'd been ill and had lived there for a while. So I needed to try and find out, whether it was classed as a house, whether it was a guest house, whatever, because obviously that was going to affect whatever we did with it. Because even looking at it from an HMO, I knew that it was going to need planning. It was going to be sui generis. It was too big just to be done under permitted development. So I spoke to the agent. Like everything in Cambridge, there was quite a bit of interest, but probably less interest than your average kind of property. But I think the reason that I managed to secure it was just relationship. the fact that I knew that I was a good buyer, and I think the owner was starting to get kind of itchy feet because they'd had a previous sale fall through. The lending was going to be quite challenging on a building this scale, and we just had everything in place. So I was going to buy it whatever. I had a couple of strategies. My strategy was either to turn it into a sui generis HMO, or the other strategy that I was thinking about was, could I keep it as a guest house, but convert it almost into like a mini apart hotel. Each room would become like an apartment, and we would let it as serviced accommodation. So I secured the property, and whilst we were doing that, I also spoke to the previous agent that the sale had fallen through with, who again luckily knew quite well, and there was quite a lot that came out of that conversation, which again I'd always advise people to do their due diligence when they're buying things. I really wanted to delve into why the previous sale had fallen down, and it came out that the previous person was also going to convert it into an HMO, but there had been a lot of issues. So normally I wouldn't bother doing a pre-app because they take too much time. But in this instance, I decided that I needed to try and find out what the issues were. And unfortunately, you can't see any of that stuff in the public domain when it's a pre-app. So I booked a pre-app. My husband is a planning consultant as well, which helps massively. So I took him along with me, and we met up with the council, and we just really delved into what the issues were. I also wanted to really clarify what the council thought the building was and what it was last recorded as, because again, you know, that was going to determine what we did with it. So we managed through that meeting to determine that the council thought that it was still C1, which is what you need for kind of large serviced accommodation. And the issues that came out, the previous person that was buying it was going to convert it into an HMO, but they had had a lot of issues with amenity standards. In Cambridge, they're really strict on bike and bin parking. And the challenge with this property, you can probably see from photos, is that it doesn't have very much front space. It's on quite a busy road, and it's got a huge back garden, but there's no back access. So it was going to be a big challenge, and we went through with the council, you know, what their views on this were, and we could see they were going to be quite strict. But equally, the fact that they said, oh, it's C1, you know, and if you wanted to change it into an HMO, you'd have to demonstrate so many different things. So coming out of that meeting, I ran the numbers on both, and at the time I thought actually keeping it as SA here could be a lot quicker to get it up and running, because we don't need to change the use class. We can still add the value. It had a huge loft, and we thought, right, we can do a loft conversion as well, and we can convert it into this apart hotel, and that'll be the quickest way to get it up and running. So that was the strategy, and we put in the planning, and we got the planning approved really quickly for that, and we started on site, and that was really when a lot of the problems first started occurring. So it was really going through some problems on site that made me change the strategy. The first problem that we had, we'd obviously had surveys done on the building, but we had an asbestos survey done, and it came back and there was literally asbestos everywhere. Not just kind of normal asbestos, the worst type, where you have to have people that come in, you know, in kind of full suits, masks, everything, to dispose of it properly. So
was it in the ceilings and things like
ceilings, fireplaces, tiles, some of the outbuildings in the back garden. It was everywhere. So that was.
I'm scrolling through some of the pictures now as you're talking about it, and I mean, it doesn't look like the sort of property where you would expect that sort of thing at all.
No, you know, I think something like that you just can't tell. but certainly from the original kind of, survey I'd had done, they hadn't really picked up on it. So that was the first challenge. But I thought, okay, that's fine. You always factor in a contingency. That's not too much of a problem. But it was really kind of the second challenge that became more of a problem. And that was the building regulations and the fire strategy. Again, I thought, seeing as we weren't changing the use class, that the building regs wouldn't be too onerous. But in Cambridge, again, one of the things, well, I think it's not just Cambridge, I think right across the country at the moment, one of the things that so many authorities are specific about is fire. Rightly so. But one of the things they said is, we need you to upgrade the building because the building is over 5 stories. You're going to have to upgrade it and bring it into current fire regulations, which I didn't have an issue with doing. But again, when you're doing serviced accommodation and you've got people that don't know each other in the property, the fire regs are even more strict. So what they wanted us to do was to put in kind of full sprinkler system. And if anyone's done sprinkler systems, one of the challenges with sprinklers is you need a huge space in order to store all the water for the sprinklers. So we looked into, we were basically going to have to build a massive building in the back garden to house the sprinklers. And like I say, there's no back access. So everything was going to have to go through the property, kind of reinforced concrete, all kinds of things. So that was, we had that as well. We then had various other things. Like I say, I designed the spec for the apartments. And I think once we started costing, all the different kitchens, because again, once you start putting in cooking facilities, it again changes the building regulations and the cost. And to do it to the kind of spec that I wanted to do it to, the budget was just literally spiraling. And then I think the other things that changed my mind was I started looking at the lending in a lot of detail on the back end. And serviced accommodation lending for a project that size is actually quite challenging. There aren't many lenders in the market, and they want to see full sets of accounts of the building being up and running for quite a few years before they'll refinance it. So that was really the final straw. I just thought, this is just going to tie up so much capital for me.
How had you financed it, Emma? Had you bought this outright, or had you got some bridge lending on it?
Yeah, no, we bought it. We bought it outright, and I had an overseas investor. So we just bought it outright, which again, looking back, thank goodness we did, with the amount of challenges that we had on the building. But yeah, I just thought back end, we're just going to tie up this capital for quite a while. And it was really just as we were going through all of this that COVID hit as well.
Just what you need. Global pandemic, when you've got to...
Yeah, it just made me think, are we doing the right thing here? What's going to happen to the serviced accommodation market? So I just, I took a long, hard look at it, and I just thought, actually, we need to be brave here and just change strategy halfway through. So we decided at this time to execute Plan B. But Plan B, going for the sui generis HMO, like I say, we knew that wasn't going to be straightforward either. We knew there were going to be lots of planning challenges. But we decided that, if we could bring the kind of predicted build cost down to make it work. Also, it just, obviously I've got a lot more experience in HMOs. The plan with serviced accommodation was never to run it myself either. I was always going to outsource it to a management company. But I just thought, actually, if we do the HMO, I can bring it into my business and we can provide, an amazing product here. But the challenge obviously was getting the planning. The other thing in Cambridge is that if you want to change a hotel or any serviced accommodation into residential use class, you've got to prove that there is no need for that hotel anymore, which you're supposed to market the property for 12 months in order to do that. So that was also going to be a bit of a challenge. So luckily we managed to kind of prove that through the fact that, as I say, the property had been on the market for a long time through the previous sale that had fallen through. And I managed to call on a few agents to write me some reports on the fact that there wasn't any need for this guest house anymore. So we managed to do that, and we managed to try and work out a scheme for the bikes, but that was very, very challenging. I think we literally submitted about 14 different schemes, ramps into the building, bike parking at the back, all kinds of things. And the council just weren't going to give on any of it. But we kind of managed to come to a solution that they were happy with. But at that point, it got called into committee. Again, in Cambridge, if you have one objection, it goes to committee. Oh. So it went to committee as well, and in HMOs, anything when it goes to committee, who knows what's going to happen. But luckily, we managed to get approval. And,
wow!
Yeah.
So I bet that was a nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it was. But like I say, I'm very lucky because I am married to a very good planning consultant. So I obviously had complete faith in him.
Was your husband quietly confident on it, or was it touch and go?
No, he's always confident. He like any planner, he obviously analyses the risk up front. But if he thought there was a significant risk, then we wouldn't have gone down that route.
Yeah.
But he knew that there was always going to be a way. So yeah, we did it. We got the planning, and then we managed to finally start the build during one of the lockdowns, which again had its own challenges, but yeah.
And it was a big refurb as well, wasn't it?
Huge.
It was a huge refurb. I mean, it was more than, kind of double what we pay for most of our HMOs up here, to be honest, Emma. Not a million miles away. But the numbers on on the project are amazing, and clearly at the back end it was just all very much.
Yeah, it was again. I mean, I think the build probably could have been less than it was. I think changing strategy halfway through didn't help us. But equally, I'm lucky that I've got really good builders who know what I do, know what I'm trying to deliver. And there were certain things that I didn't want to compromise on, the end spec. And by this stage, if you're going to do a big HMO like we were going to do, I wanted to create something that didn't exist in Cambridge. So we have gone to a much higher spec than we would do normally, even on our, we do high spec even on our student HMOs here. But I wanted this to be absolute standout. And also because of the cost of the building, the cost of the build, I knew that we needed to maximise the rental values that we were going to get for it as well. And like I say, because we've got the big rooms as well, I wanted to create something that just doesn't exist. So I think, we've managed to achieve that, and that's been demonstrated in how quickly we managed to let it. But definitely, there was some challenges with the build cost. I think there was lots of things. I think the main thing is the thing I've learned about building is have a contingency and then have another contingency on top. We had all kinds of planning conditions as well that added to the build cost. Things like we had to put in retrospective mechanical ventilation because it's on a main road and they wanted kind of fresh air coming into the building from the back of the building. They wanted us to do acoustic glazing in all the windows. We had to have sound surveys. Again, it's all these kind of things that if you're going to change the use class of a building, you just need to really, really know your building regs and your planning regulations because it can add so much cost to a project.
Would you say that this is the sort of project that most people should wait to do? They should do it a bit further down the line when they've got the experience and maybe can afford to carry a bit more risk? Or, and I say this looking at the numbers and looking at how good it is and the rental confidence it carries. So actually, as a package, it's almost a golden goose now. There's so much money coming out the back end of it, and it's going to perform so well simply because of where it's located as well as the spec. So that, from that point of view, it's amazing. It's exactly what we want. But is that, and this sort of project, with so many question marks, where people should start, Emma? What do you think?
I think if you're just getting into HMOs, I wouldn't do something this big to start off with. I think it depends how much building experience you've got. Like I say, as we were talking about earlier, I think in the beginning days, I would probably bulldoze in, a bit like yourself, Andy, and just kind of do things. And again, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what can go wrong on a project until you've had that experience a lot. And I have to say, there's very few projects that I've done where I haven't experienced problems. I think you get problems on most building projects, but I think it's how much that problem costs. They're always sortable, but it's at what cost? And I think it's what that does to your numbers. And I think it's just your risk appetite. If you've got investors involved and other people's money, you need to make sure that you're protecting those people. So I think to answer your question, again, because we're talking about the kind of capital that we're talking about in this project as well, I definitely couldn't afford to make mistakes like that in the beginning. So I think, it's I would start small personally. If I was going into HMOs now and doing projects, I think, again, start on something that's quite easy to turn around, quick to turn around. Cut your teeth on those kind of projects and then move into larger projects afterwards, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong.
Well, guys, Emma's case study will be available inside the HMO roadmap. I really would recommend you go and have a look at it just to get the context about exactly what it is that Emma bought and what she did to it and how she made it all work, because it really is an incredible project. I think it's super inspiring but incredibly honest, and actually the story that you share in more detail as well, Emma, is really, really inspiring, but also very honest, and you're just candid about the challenges and the fact that it certainly isn't always straightforward. So it's a brilliant case study. Thank you so much for sharing it.
You're welcome.
So Emma, one last question. If somebody listening today feels inspired by what you've talked about and what you've achieved, but are kind of right at the very beginning, they haven't done anything yet, maybe this is even the first podcast they've listened to, and I think you're a great person to ask this question to, because you're so level-headed about this. I don't think you're biased in any way. Where would you recommend somebody like that begins if they want to go away and start building a portfolio to ultimately kind of try and do what you've done? Where would you recommend they begin?
So I think the main thing you need to do is just get some knowledge. And I think, today there are so many great kind of free kind of opportunities where you can kind of really learn a lot. Podcasts like this, for example, great podcasts, lots of great magazines, Instagram. So many people share so much great information on every stage of their project on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all those kind of social media portals. But I think the thing that's probably helped me the most and got me the furthest is my network. And I would say, even if you're just starting out, I would start trying to build some kind of network from day one. I wish I'd started even earlier than I did. So I think, whether it's developing that network, even on social media initially, reaching out and connecting with people, go along to your local property meetings in your locality, try and meet people there. But also, I think, depending on how quickly you want to reach your goals, I would always say get some help. If you can afford to get a mentor or a coach or join a mastermind group or something early on, I just think you can't replace what you're going to learn from that, because you'll be dealing with people that have actually done it. And I think that is the best possible knowledge that you can have. And I think after that, once you've just got some base knowledge, I would say just go for it. I think you're never going to know everything. And I think as long as you do what we talked about, maybe not starting on the bigger projects, start on something small where, if something goes wrong, it's not going to cost you lots and lots of money. I think, again, you can read every book, watch every podcast. Nothing is going to replicate actually doing it yourself and learning. So I think, just go for it. I think don't be scared. or if you're scared, get some support through someone that's done it. But just do it. And I think, it's important to do kind of one at a time in the early days and find out if it is what you want to do, because it does take over your life. You've got to be passionate about it. You're going to come up against lots of hurdles. Sometimes, they can be quite challenging. So you've got to really, really love what you do. So that would be, my advice to someone starting.
Well, I think there is some incredible advice there, and I subscribe to all of that, Emma. I want to say a huge thank you for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love talking property with you anyway. You know that, because we have so much fun chatting about this sort of stuff. How can people get involved with what you're doing, Emma, or how can they reach out and contact you?
So probably the best way of getting in contact with me is through Instagram. I'm very active on there. Emma J.R. Stubbings, if anyone wants to look at my projects, or send me a message. I'm also on LinkedIn, Emma Stubbings. That's probably the best way. But yeah, there's scope to get involved in projects, all kinds of things. So yeah, just reach out if you want to have a chat.
Amazing. Emma, thank you so much once again for joining me on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure, and I already can't wait to see you, which is only going to be a couple of weeks' time at the HMO Mastermind. But thank you so much for coming and joining us today.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.